Hello, Dr. Cornell and colleagues. For my exploration of inequality presentation, I chose to focus on Native Americans. I chose this group primarily because I not only wanted to educate myself about the ways in which social work practice can better provide culturally relevant services to Native Americans, but also to shed light on the historical and present oppression Native Americans continue to face. Firstly, I feel it is necessary to highlight some of the horrifying historical events associated with the oppression and genocide of Native Americans to gain a better understanding of institutional racism that continues to perpetuate social injustices. White colonization and the massacres of the Native Americans was promoted due to racialization and essentially was utilized as a strategy to promote ideas of superiority and white supremacy. Essentially, this aim of achieving quote unquote civilization was leveraged to not only justify the forced assimilation and stripping Native Americans of their rights, lands, culture, and language, but ultimately led to mass genocide. The massacres, such as the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, the Battle of Sand Creek, to name a few, as well as racist legislation such as the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and the Dawes Act of 1887, led to the marginalization associated with stripping Native Americans of their land and forcing them into reservations. If you look to the lower right-hand corner, you can see a representation of the lands of Native Americans being stolen over several decades, which kind of helps to put it into perspective, and it also is extremely alarming and heart-wrenching to imagine. These racist policies during westward expansion led to Native Americans experiencing intergenerational trauma today. The negative implications of their historical experiences present several barriers, considering this trauma has been associated with negative outcomes concerning health, mental health, education, employment, and substance use concerns. Next, I think it's important to connect some of these concerns we discussed to Jung's five faces of oppression. Cultural imperialism, as discussed by Benner, Loeffler, and Pope 2022, relates to the very way in which dominant groups and their narratives create a sense of otherness and minimized value by rendering oppressed groups invisible, exotic, or deviant. And this is a quote. One could say that this was the very notion and embedded ideology that paved the way for other forms of oppression, such as marginalization, powerlessness, exploitation, and violence. This oppression continues to subject Native Americans to significant disparities and injustices concerning physical and mental concerns, economic strain, environmental implication, as well as social and cultural concerns. This is evident by data revealing disparities concerning poverty and homelessness, wage gaps and lack of employment opportunities, higher mortality rates and disease, as well as higher rates of suicide. While we already discussed history of cultural imperialism, it's also important to discuss the ways in which this history ties into educational and employment disparities witnessed today. The history and trauma concerning Native American boarding schools subjected Native American youth to powerlessness, exploitation, and violence. Perhaps one of the most heart-wrenching discoveries I made when researching was the ways in which Native American children were stripped from their homes and their families and culture and forced into these boarding schools. These promoted the racist agenda of cultural imperialism and was justified by the notion that quote unquote assimilating and civilizing Native Americans was in their best interest. So this means innocent children were subjected to what authorities at the time called punitive measures. Although many Native Americans reported that these were physically, mentally, emotionally, and sexual abuse. Um, as well as malnourishment and harsh labor requirements. Consequentially, today, Native Americans face disparities concerning educational outcomes. The economic hardship as a result of the poverty and homelessness plaguing reservations today has contributed to these outcomes. As the National Council of State Legislature reported, not only do Native American youth perform 2 to 3 grade levels below their white peers, but they are 247% more likely to drop out of school and 200% more likely to be expelled than white students. Data such as this reveals the impact of intergenerational trauma, oppression, and institutional racism. In addition to educational disparities, it's important to recognize employment and economic disparities as well. Studies reveal that Native Americans are paid less than other Americans. Studies also reveal that Native Americans disproportionately represent those in poverty compared to other Americans. In 2016, for instance, 26% of American Indians and Alaska Native people were in poverty, compared with 14% for the United States as a whole. And this was a study by Theobald and Spencer in 2019. There are also disparities concerning lack of opportunities for employment. So, due to a lack of employment opportunities among Native American reservations, the head of household is required to seek employment outside of their community and/or reservation, which leaves other family members to assume the role of caregiver for their children. In addition to educational and employment disparities, it's important to recognize the oppression concerning physical and mental health for Native Americans. Not only do Native Americans experience barriers concerning access, but due to economic injustices and poverty, they often are uninsured. Even those who are insured struggle with several obstacles, as you can see in the chart to the right. Native Americans experience higher rates of cancer, heart disease, diabetes, alcoholism, mental health disorders, asthma, and liver disease. When it comes to mental health concerns, Native Americans are disproportionately impacted by substance use disorders, PTSD, trauma, and suicide. So here I've listed more statistics representing the disparities and oppression concerning education, physical and mental health, poverty, homelessness, and employment among Native Americans. For instance, concerning poverty, studies reveal that almost 30% of American Indians and Alaska Natives were in poverty compared to 14% of the United States as a whole. This also translates into concerns about homelessness. For instance, the Partnership with Native Americans reports that there are 90,000 homeless or underhoused Native American families, and less than half of these homes are even connected to public sewer systems. Regarding mental health concerns, in 2019, suicide was the second leading cause of death for American Indian Alaska Natives between the ages of 10 and 34. Also, American Indians are 600% more likely to die from heart disease than other Americans, 226% more likely to die from diabetes, and 600% more likely to die from TB. So, this all leads to the question, how do we advocate and adopt an anti-oppressive practice within the field of social work that allows us to effectively promote the holistic well-being of the Native American community? Considering social work practice often fails to consider that Western therapy approaches are inconsistent with many Native American cultures and often serve as a form of Western colonization. It's imperative for social workers to not only adopt an attitude of cultural humility, but cultural competence as well, by educating themselves about the history and current oppression facing Native Americans. This can also be done by immersing oneself in their culture, learning from elders and others in the community, and really being willing to open up authentic and empathetic conversation about what this group finds most effective for them. I also think it's important for us as social workers to challenge our biases and stereotypical thinking. By acknowledging that change is necessary, we can really promote more effective, culturally sensitive, and relevant strategies for empowering Native Americans. And on a macro level, social workers can also advocate for policies that promote equality, change, and social justice for Native Americans. This leads me to the discussion of power imbalances, as well as how understanding and acting against oppression helps to promote this cultural humility we should be striving for as social workers. Considering traditional American treatment modalities haven't clearly been as effective as culturally relevant concepts of healing, it's important to rethink some of these therapeutic approaches, particularly those that are shown to be ineffective. Some of the ways to support empowerment of Native American communities, combat power imbalances, and promote anti-oppressive practice may be to look at what has been shown to be effective, such as wellness centers, culture and language immersion schools, and tradition-based programs that promote Native American practices and community resiliency. Overall, it's important to implement a holistic approach, including treatment modalities and techniques that reduce authority and power and aim to include the traditions and values of Native Americans, such as aspects of spiritual well-being, family involvement, and collectivism, as well as cultural practices. To conclude, it is essential that social work practice aims to understand the needs of Native Americans and adopt culturally sensitive and relevant therapeutic approaches. Social workers should aim to adopt an attitude of cultural humility, educate themselves and develop cultural competence, challenge bias, and promote more effective, culturally sensitive, and relevant strategies for empowering Native Americans. On a macro level, we can advocate for policies that promote equality and change and social justice for this group. Overall, understanding the history and oppression of Native Americans allows social workers to not only refrain from paternalistic and authoritative attitudes that impede self-determination, but to really empower this group to enhance community resilience and their healing and just overall well-being and health. So I'd like to thank you for listening to my presentation. I appreciate your time and I hope that you all have an amazing Thanksgiving. This next slide here is references, and again, I'd just like to thank you for listening.